Hello, everybody. This is Steve Pearson at ICER. Thank you for joining. Because we only have an hour for each of these webinars, I wanted to go ahead and get started right away. And as I think all of you know, these will be recorded so that we can put them on the website and they can be enjoyed by generations to come. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a really special opportunity for ICER. We are in the second year of a visiting fellowship program that's funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. And we decided this year to do it slightly differently in that we are undergoing an overall update to our value assessment framework this year. And we thought we would invite people from around the world who might have different methodologic and kind of experience perspectives on a core topic of our assessment update, which is the cost effectiveness thresholds that ICER should use in its recommendations or analyses for U.S. policymakers. Now, this is just a small part, obviously, of our overall methods of value assessment, but as all of you on the line know, it's been a core issue in health economics, in ethics, and in other fields for decades. So we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to kind of convene a group, but to share this conversation and engage with many others around the country. So I believe we have over 50, how many people registered for this meeting?
About 80.
About 80. So this includes, the people on the phone are a healthy sample of some of the leading health economists in the United States. They also include participants in ICER's membership program, both on the payer and PBM side and the life science side. And they include members from ICER's independent appraisal committees, many of whom are health economists in their own right, or who have certainly grappled with these issues through their work on appraisal committees. So what are the goals for today and this overall kind of series of webinars? The overall goal, again, is to try to view this from different perspectives to inform our thinking and to trigger further discussions and maybe research going forward. The goal is not, and I think this is important for me to say, the goal is not to come up with the right answer. ICER is going to come out with its draft proposal for its value assessment framework update on August 16th for public comment, and that will start a longer process of our thinking. So this is happening in a good time frame to help inform us, but it is not, again, meant to be a process in which we will have a winner at the end of the 5 seminars. And yet, we hope it will engender a lively debate, because we know that there are very different views on this topic, and we hope to hear from them all. The way we're going to structure it is today's lecture is going to start off and try to deal at a relatively high level with some of the different philosophical approaches to even thinking about thresholds, whether there should be any, whether if there are, what should their basis be. And then we're going to kind of slice this broader issue into different chunks. The next webinar tomorrow will look at willingness to pay methodology as a basis for cost effectiveness thresholds, looking at some of the work that many of you are familiar with that has either tried to root a cost effectiveness threshold in the per capita GDP or in surveys of individuals' willingness to forego kind of money for health and other approaches. The third webinar will continue with willingness to pay, because we'll also look at things like the value of a statistical life, some new work from Chuck Phelps on relative risk aversion, and other approaches linked to the general willingness to pay kind of methodology. On July 30th, we will shift gears and focus on opportunity cost as a basis for cost effectiveness threshold thinking, both here and obviously some of the work done internationally. And the last webinar on August 1st will kind of step back again and think broadly about thresholds, but also tackle some equity considerations around whether there should be different thresholds for certain types of conditions or situations. And we'll talk a bit about the health sector versus societal perspectives as a part of that thinking. So we're very happy to have, again, our visiting fellows be part of this. And they are this year, by the way, Jens Rueger, whom you will meet in a second, as our lead presenter today, Carl Claxton, Sean Sullivan, and Chris McCabe. They will share the roles of lead presenters with Rick Chapman, the Director of Health Economics at ICER, and myself being the host, and we will moderate some of the discussion. So with that, let me hand it over to Jens to kick it off. I've forgotten to introduce the slide or to advance the slides, but Jens will just introduce himself briefly, and then we'll get started, following by responses from Dave Van Ness and Patricia Danton.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for the invitation. Very exciting to be here with all of you, and a particular honor to kick off this discussion here. It's philosophical approaches, but also want to say that in kind of discussing how we would take that forward, I will share some international experiences with drug price regulation and what the implications might be for determining cost-effectiveness thresholds in the US. As an introduction, I'm employed by Hoffmann La Roche. I was leading the global access team, which has pricing, health economics, public affairs, market access as its remit at Roche for the last 7.5 years. Before that, I've had similar roles at Novartis and Pfizer. I've stepped down from that role at the moment. As you saw on the slide before, I'm very proud of being elected for president at ISPOR, so my term starts next year, and I'm, as of last week, also on the faculty of the Choice Institute at the University of Washington as affiliate professor. My plan for the next 15-20 minutes is to share some of the experiences with HTA systems, some of which use ICER thresholds. Some other prominent health systems around the world don't use an ICER threshold. There's a two-step approach looking at assessment of the evidence followed by price negotiations, and then share some thoughts, some very preliminary thoughts on the implications for the US and summary and conclusions. So in terms of HTA approaches, basically, I think the majority, if not all, developed countries now have established national HTA systems, but there are two basic archetypes in there. There are those archetypes that use cost effectiveness and incremental cost effectiveness ratio-based thresholds, and there are those that use this two-step reference pricing approach. In the first column, I mean, we have prominent examples: the UK, Australia, Canada, Sweden, and the Netherlands. They will all say that cost effectiveness is an important criterion, but it's not the only criterion. It's an input into a deliberative process, so it's not an algorithmic formula when they make decisions. Price in these systems is considered as an input into these discussions. There is only an implicit negotiation of the price, because typically systems would review the evidence, do the cost effectiveness approach, come up with a preliminary assessment on that basis, which allows the developer then to potentially adjust the price if the preliminary conclusion is that this drug is not considered cost effective. So there is some element of negotiation, but not a kind of formal price negotiation. And it has been kind of typically used in countries that have a strong national health service, kind of a centralized approach to that, and has a strong mandate on health as a public good rather than individual choice. On the right column, HTA is a two-step reference pricing approach. First step, assessment of the added patient benefit, reviewing all the evidence that exists there, comparative effectiveness research, and on that basis, there will be kind of a decision tree there that says if there is no added benefit, then we don't need to go into a price negotiation. We just reference the price against the cheapest alternative with similar efficacy in the market. But if there is an added benefit, that then leads to a price negotiation, and this price negotiation will be informed by that added benefit. The higher the benefit, the more flexibility there is on price. It does include information around cost effectiveness, but typically the systems don't calculate a cost effectiveness ratio or threshold. These are often decentralized systems that have some kind of national assessment, but then delegate a lot of the actual coverage decisions to autonomous regions in the countries or different payers in the countries. And the EU4, we don't see the UK as part of the EU5 anymore. So the EU4 use this: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, but also important countries like Japan, Switzerland, and Australia and Austria. To give you an example of how that works in practice in Germany, since 2011, the famous AMNOG process was established, which introduced price negotiations in Germany. All medicines are reimbursed at the manufacturer set price immediately after marketing approval. But there is a standardized process, a very rigorous process for benefit assessment, which starts before initiation of phase 3 with an early scientific advice that manufacturers are strongly requested to follow. It would discuss aspects of clinical trial design, in particular the choice of the appropriate comparator and endpoint that is considered patient relevant. The important phase then starts after marketing approval. A reimbursement dossier is submitted by the developer. It's a sizable dossier, up to 5,000 pages. It is reviewed by the Joint Federal Commission, GBA, which usually then delegates the technical review to IQWiC, the Institute for Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare in Germany. The German social law gives a very strong guidance how that review should take place. It has to focus on patient-relevant endpoints, and it is specifically listed in the law that mortality, morbidity, and health-related quality of life are those endpoints. And Germans, as rigorous as they are, they say if these are the things that are mentioned in the law, then these are the only things that are patient-relevant. Everything else is not patient-relevant. We come back to that. And there is a strong focus on high-quality evidence. So typically, IQWiC would require randomized controlled trials. There are a few exceptions. They're very skeptical on real-world data and external controls in other areas. They would look at the assessment for specific subgroups if there are patient subgroups that have heterogeneous outcomes. And they issue a two-dimensional benefit assessment. The first one is the extent of the benefit. There are 6 categories going from major, which would be curative, for example, considerable, extension of survival, minor, which means a reduction in side effects, non-quantifiable. There is a benefit, but the evidence is so scant at this point in time that it cannot be considered, cannot be quantified here, but it is an added benefit, and then there is a no benefit, and there might be a situation where there is less benefit that is unusual but happens. And then they would have a level of certainty where they say proof if it is based on 2 randomized controlled trials, an indication if there is 1 randomized trial and some additional evidence, and hint if it's based primarily on non-comparative evidence. In the absence of an added benefit, the drug is reference priced. So at that point, when there's no added benefit, the manufacturer has an option to opt out from that process. And in about 20% of the cases, manufacturers have said here that they don't want to be reference priced because that price would set a precedent for other countries that they would try to avoid. Where there is an added benefit, price negotiations start, formal process, 4 to 5 rounds, takes up to 6 months with the head association of the German sickness funds. And if no agreement is reached, then an arbitration committee will make that decision there, and that is binding for the sick funds and the developer of that medicine. Cost effectiveness and thresholds were heavily debated and during that time, but it was found non-constitutional in Germany to make trade-offs between different patient groups, different diseases, very much rooted in our history and things that happened during the Nazi regime, but very different from what other countries would say, where, I mean, clearly Karl will make that point, where it is important to look at the opportunity costs of kind of funding one area and then having to this money not being available in other areas. But in Germany, it was very clear we don't want to trade off a diabetes patient against an oncology patient or rare disease patient. So cost effectiveness at that point was ruled out. Cost effectiveness through efficiency frontier was something which was included initially in there. There were many methodological issues around that. It was very impractical to use it. It is not being used at this point anymore. Budget impact and cost effectiveness in the sense of looking at price per different outcomes, not typically QALYs, is provided as information, in particular during the arbitration process. There is a request for keeping the budget stable. So this is one of the, I will come back to that, one of the key kind of underlying constructs to justify cost effectiveness. So Germany has what is called Beitragssatzstabilität, typical long German word, means that the insurance premiums, which are half paid by the employer, half by the employee, they should keep stable. They shouldn't increase dramatically. That is a kind of budget restriction, but there is a strong feeling that if we're tough in the off-patent segment of the market and apply price pressures, we can meet Beitragssatzstabilität without having to trade off between different disease segments. The two-step approach, has been done in Germany, has been done in France, very similar processes for this, is considered very successful. And the focus here has been on discouraging Me Too drug development. That was really kind of at the heart of when this was introduced, that we saw the 12 beta blocker or PPI or other drugs come to market. And so it was seen as a very pragmatic approach to say, in the absence of an added benefit, just set the price at the lowest competitor. So that sends a clear signal to industry to develop drugs that have a true patient benefit. We have seen, as I mentioned, that in Germany, 20% of the medicines that have been approved since 2011 have then not been launched in that market. But politically, that has not been an issue because everybody kind of in the end agreed, well, if they don't have a benefit over existing therapies, we don't really need them. This is not a loss to patients and not to introduce that drug. So that is acceptable here. The discussions have been around the views on what are patient-relevant endpoints and what is evidence. As I said, the German situation, if only mortality, morbidity, and HR quality of life are listed, then these are the only patient-relevant endpoints. And other aspects, impact on families, progression-free survival, intermediate endpoints, they have been rejected. Other agencies, NICE, would have language that reads like patient-relevant endpoints include mortality, morbidity, and HR quality of life. So they also have the emphasis on that, but this opens the door also to include other endpoints. And the consequences have been that several endpoints from pivotal studies that regulators considered were not found acceptable by IQWiG. That's a big discussion. Even sustained viral response for hepatitis C drugs, which people think is a surrogate endpoint for survival, was not accepted by IQWiG as an endpoint. It was overruled and by the GBA that said it's still something that we consider. Medicine developers, like a company like Roche, we have really taken this to heart. And an important step there is, when we design our internal drug candidates, we would put up a target product profile, and the Roche target product profile includes what is the target added benefit rating that we want to achieve in France and Germany. And so we would have that conversation early on and say, okay, if we cannot achieve a certain added benefit, that means the price is going to be very difficult to achieve. And this means that we should probably be more aggressive in our development program or not develop this asset. The other countries use ICER thresholds, and I think the starting point is almost like in mathematics. You start from certain key assumptions that you take for granted that are given to you from a political perspective. So in these countries, typically it is that you have a fixed healthcare budget. There is no way to go above that. You want to provide equitable access to all, and you want to maximize health across all people covered by the National Health Service. Kind of mathematically leads you to something where, or economically, I'm a mathematician, so I think mathematics are the kind of is the underlying science in the world. But it leads you to an opportunity cost where you have to trade off between new and existing technologies and across patients and disease segments. It leads you to a linear approach in there. A quality is a quality, a dollar is a dollar. That's a mathematical consequence of that. You focus on cost rather than benefit, so you take cost for granted and you want to maximize benefit within that cost, not the other way around to say that I want maximum benefits. Then I can think about what the cost implications are. And the thresholds represent budgetary constraints that are kind of, the budget has been given based on a political process. The threshold then needs to reflect that budget rather than willingness to pay. So I think an important discussion that we'll have over the next days, how much will willingness to pay drive thresholds, how much will budgets drive thresholds. Overall, of course, these ICER thresholds are very consistent with the objectives of an NHS system that has a fixed budget, provides equitable access, and maximizes health gains. It is a static perspective. We always talk about dynamic efficiency, static efficiency. I still find that this is more kind of erring on the side of being statically efficient, and it's not completely clear how it affects innovation. And that's part of research. Has Nice, for example, in the UK, fulfilled its mandate of fostering innovation. There are different systems to setting the threshold. In the UK, somewhere magically £20,000 emerged in 1999. That was something that we have worked with. There's some research now. Carl will certainly comment on that says you could have other starting points in there. There are a couple of exceptions in there. Cancer is typically considered against a threshold of £30,000. There are the end-of-life criteria when patients have less than 2 years of typical life expectancy. A threshold of 50,000 has been accepted. And there is now a new process which is much more generous for highly specialized technologies, where it can go up to 100 to 300,000 pounds. The appraisal committees have gone beyond these thresholds in some instances, and in particular since 2012, innovativeness has been increasingly cited as a reason for going above that, following some work from Sir Ian Kennedy and others were asked to review NICE in the context of innovation, and found that it is not completely clear how that is considered. So often now appraisal committees would cite innovation as a reason for going above the thresholds. There are temporary access mechanisms where drugs, where there's still a lot of uncertainty and it's not clear whether we would meet those thresholds. And so drugs can be entered into the Cancer Drugs Fund. It's a mechanism for something which in the US would probably be called coverage with evidence development. So they're covered for that time, but evidence has been developed. In order to meet these thresholds, developers frequently need to provide confidential discounts and pay for performance agreements. There is still a feeling that the UK rejects more drugs than other countries, particularly in oncology. And as I said, this 20,000 is a kind of stake in the ground, but there is a lot of research coming out that says the marginal effectiveness of the system is much higher, which means that the threshold should be significantly lower. And the number I have is 12,963, roughly, maybe a few pounds off. Which would kind of say that many more drugs would be rejected on that basis. There are other countries with a strong health economics tradition that use thresholds, but Sweden, for example, would say we don't have a fixed budget. We will raise the money that is required to fund important innovation, and they have thresholds which consequently can vary, and they vary by disease severity. So some research that has been recently done says that the lowest cost-effectiveness ratio for therapies that have been declined has been 80,000 euros. The highest that has been approved has been 130,000 euros. So first of all, these numbers are significantly higher than 20 to 30,000 pounds. So the conversion is like 1.15 or something. And these different ratios are driven particularly by disease severity. So the median approval in non-severe diseases is for drugs which are around 80,000 euros per QALY. For severe diseases, it is above 110,000. So there are countries that use thresholds, but they don't use one threshold. They would modify the threshold on different criteria like disease severity. Others would include unmet need. In a way, the end-of-life criteria is probably something that I would also consider as something that's driven by unmet need considerations. We have significant tensions between ICER-based countries and the reference price system countries in Europe, in particular for innovative products, and it's driven by different willingness to pay for healthcare and mechanisms that we have in Europe, like external reference pricing and parallel trade. Fundamentally, countries like France and Germany have been extremely strict on drugs that have no demonstrated added benefit, but they have been generous for drugs that have demonstrated that benefit. So in a way, because they were not linked to a fixed budget, they were kind of overpaying for innovative products. But there have been some changes in there. So for example, in France, the number of products that have been granted these highest benefit categories has been reduced, and there are some commentators that would say this was as a consequence of budget constraints in there. So that's politically driven. The difference between the UK and Germany and France in Europe is that the UK is spending about 20% less on healthcare than Germany and France, 8% versus 10% roughly. Partly that may be driven by efficiencies in the healthcare system, partly that is a different willingness to pay. So countries which are perceived to have similar economic situations are spending less on health. And so even when stretching the thresholds, the UK system has been struggling with innovative products, and developers have been struggling then to meet the price expectations in the UK. I was getting questions from the German Ministry of Health or from the German general manager of Roche to say that, look, I mean, we are willing to pay these prices, but if you're offering the UK a 30% lower price for this product, then sorry, I also want to have this thing. So they should pay up to what this innovation is. So this is a problem that we are facing that has been driving more intransparent rebate mechanisms like pay for performance or straight discounts, which are quite substantial in the UK, but I can't go deeper into that. So that's the European situation, two archetypes. What does that mean for the US? So the first thing is European systems have been much more successful than the US in keeping drug prices under control. Things like what we see in this example, multiple sclerosis or anti-TNFs couldn't happen. We did have price increases in Europe in the past, but they were very much pegged to consumer price indices or when drugs had more evidence. But I mean, there is something that is fundamentally at odds in the US system. And of course, these things set anchors for new drug launches. And that is something which we have seen in the interesting research that Howard Bach, Berndt, and Conti have been publishing when they look at oncology drugs and try to see kind of what is driving prices. It's not the effectiveness. So the cost effectiveness of these drugs is all over the place. What is driving prices is primarily the year of launch, and every year on annual basis, cancer drugs seem to get $8,000 more expensive because the comparators are getting more expensive, and you can piggyback on that. As a short kind of aside here, this is of course wonderful from a developer perspective, but it's also kind of concerning in here. So what I'm trying to do on this slide is just to provide you with a hypothetical example, but which is quite realistic. When we at Roche were looking at developing a product in phase 3, and we would particularly look at what are the revenue projections for the US and for the EU 5 countries, and other countries in the world, they would be more like a kind of a proportional factor to that. So if you take a typical product, you have similar patient numbers in the US and the EU 5, around 320 million. You assume that it takes 5 years to reach peak sales. You assume that you can get twice the price in the US, and you would typically launch the product 2 years earlier in the US because FDA is faster than EMA, and in Europe you are then spending some time in price negotiations. So when you have this product in these two geographies, 80% of your revenues for the first 10 years comes out of the US, and that puts a kind of high emphasis on kind of what you achieve in the US. Developers are focusing on the US, and in a way we have been opportunistic in Europe because there was no penalty on the US, so we could accept prices in Europe as long as they were above our marginal cost of goods at the end. I mean, they were significantly above that, but so the US has become very important from a manufacturer's perspective, and it has led in some ways that there is a feeling that European payers are not only kind of getting away with lower prices, but they can even reject drugs and just wait until they have better evidence from the US, because it's quite clear that manufacturers would want to launch the product in the US. So even where I have concerns about the long-term outcomes, I can wait. There is no penalty for an ex-US payer to reject a drug. If it's really a good drug, it will still be there for us to make a decision later. So this is something which you have to keep in mind, because any change in the U.S. situation is very sensitive from a developer perspective. I'm not saying that we will go bankrupt immediately, but it will affect our ability to invest and develop new drugs. So we'll have more discussions as the seminars continue, but introduction of HTA with ICER thresholds in the US will address a number of very specific issues. So the first thing, I still think the justification for thresholds is that you have a certain set of ingoing assumptions, a fixed budget, a national or equitable access mandate, and maximizing health. And there are some health parts of the U.S. healthcare system where I would argue, yes, I mean, you have these conditions. Some state Medicaid programs have a very fixed budget. They want to maximize, they want to provide equitable access, but there are many parts of the U.S. systems that don't have these ingoing assumptions. And so it is difficult then to say, we come to the conclusion that thresholds are the right thing to do. If we had thresholds, they will definitely be very different for different health plans. And that will affect, I mean, how do health plans position themselves in there? What are the kinds of clients that they would attract with that? What are the selection effects that we are seeing? And it would make it very transparent in the US that there is a very differential willingness to pay for health in different parts of the population. As an ingoing part for our seminar here, it was recommended we all read Uwe Reinhardt's recent book that was now published after his death. He starts that in saying the fundamental question is, do we in the US believe that a child born into a poor family has the same chances of getting a medicine than a child born into a rich family? And he says it's politically not acceptable to say that there is a difference, but everything practical shows us that it is, and specifying thresholds would make that very transparent. So, what are the kinds of political implications that we have here? And I mean, as a European, I'm fascinated about the litigation system in the US. I don't know. I mean, when you start rationing and not making cover certain things, how that would deal with that, that would certainly, you need to get the lawyers under control here before you can do these things. So the question that I come to, and I'm finishing in kind of in a minute, is does the US really need to go all the way to ICER thresholds? I find it politically and pragmatically much more natural to go a first step and increase price competition between similar products through a reference price mechanism or selective procurement in there, where you anchor launch prices to the price of current products, in a similar way like France and Germany, but hopefully with a state-of-the-art perspective on value and evidence. We have seen some examples where competitive purchasing was done for innovative medicines like Express Scripts with hepatitis C drugs. I'm still surprised that this does not happen more often. You can maintain choice for consumers if they pay the difference. That's a typical approach that is followed in Europe. If there is uncertainty whether these drugs are similar or not, you have mechanisms like coverage with evidence development that you can use here. And once then differences have been proven, prices can be adjusted. That's possible. And you will still need to address a number of complex issues like what happens when products have multiple indications, some of which may have a clear benefit, others that have not proven a benefit. What's about annual reference price adjustments? Are they allowed? And will competition be enough to adjust the inflated prices that exist in some categories like multiple sclerosis? So my summary and conclusion is some form of price regulation is required in the US in order to create a sustainable financing environment that continues to incentivize true innovation. So I'm, even coming from pharma, I'm not concerned if you are kind of being hard on us when we have products which are similar to existing products, but I want you to be generous when we have products that truly deliver innovation for patients. All countries in Europe in some ways follow a reference pricing approach, even in the cost effectiveness. When there is no added benefit, automatically, I mean, you're pegged against the existing products in the market. Innovative products seem to fare better in countries without thresholds. Any change in the US pricing system will have significant implications for drug developers, so we have to at least have a conversation around that. The US should consider creating more price competition between products with similar or equal benefits, so some form of price referencing. But the formal introduction of thresholds will highlight differential willingness to pay, and that might be very difficult in the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens. That was a great introduction to the topics that we're going to cover in these webinars. And I bet about at least 2/3 of you on the webinar would love to jump right in with a comment or a question right now. What we're going to do is to have two prepared kind of responders, but this is a time when if you do have a question or a comment, you can start to submit them through in the chat function or questions. So there's a question kind of arrow on the kind of sidebar for this webinar. So please feel free to start submitting those while we hear first from two well-respected health economists in the United States, Dave Van Ness and Patricia Danton. Dave, why don't you go first and again share your response to Jens's presentation.
Thank you, Steve and Jens. This was an excellent introduction and very helpful. I guess, you know, I should introduce myself. I'm a professor of health policy and administration at Penn State University. And I've historically worked more in the methodology side of applied cost effectiveness analysis, and have only fairly recently begun to think about the deeper policy questions. Some of this stemmed from a discussion that I had too long ago with John Carnan and James Lomas about, you know, what would we do if we had to have a threshold in the United States? What would it be based on, given that we have such a decentralized system without a single fixed budget? And so I want to pick a few points of Jens's presentation that I think are quite important to consider, and that is, do we need to have a fixed budget or a concept of a fixed budget in the United States in order to be able to conceptualize the meaningfulness of a threshold? I think it makes it certainly easier if there's a fixed budget for healthcare. We can operate clearly within an extra welfarist frame and try to maximize the health that is generated from that budget, assuming that, of course, you know, that we can measure that health and we can agree on the ethical distribution, social welfare function that underlies that. But I think I can make the argument, at least I hope I can at least put the argument out there, that even in the absence of a single payer in the United States or a fixed budget, that really nobody thinks the United States should be spending more on healthcare than what they are. And so from a societal perspective, I think we can count whatever it is we are spending today effectively as a fixed budget. And that any system based on a threshold that would preserve that is at best treading water and perhaps even represents an upper bound for what we should be willing to pay for healthcare from a societal point of view. I think where we have considerations beyond that, we have to think about whether the threshold is a formal go or no-go decision point, what degree of influence it has on the decision process, or whether it is simply a marker that gets included perhaps in formal or informal multi-criteria decision analysis, but thinking of it as a marker for net health benefit. So if we estimate a threshold, in my opinion, it should be representing the point above which, if we pay for a new intervention, we would expect total population health to decline, because those who gain health from the adoption and coverage of the new treatment do not gain enough health to fully compensate those who lose it. Of course, in the United States, I think we have to confront fundamental underlying issue, and I appreciate Jens's comments on Germany and how this relates to Germany's past and considerations about pitting groups of patients against one another. we have that issue in the United States, but I think it's more subtle. And that is, these decisions will put identifiable patient groups who stand to benefit from a specific intervention against the interest of statistical lives. And those statistical lives are harder to identify with, and they certainly don't have the well-organized and funded groups representing their interests that patient groups do. And so we have to think about whether it's possible to be an advocate for those statistical lives, and that the threshold actually can play that role. Whether it becomes a negotiating point in the two-step process, or whether it's a hard decision point, or whether it's incorporated into MCDA, I still believe that an opportunity cost threshold for the U.S. Is worth pursuing. And I think we can look into, for example, considerations about what happens to the cost of healthcare, what happens to the price of insurance when new technology is adopted. I saw that as also an interesting point that Jens raised with the goal in the German system to have premium stability. In the U.S., if we think of increasing health insurance premiums as inducing individuals to drop insurance coverage or insurers to raise copayments and coinsurance rates, I think we can identify health effects in a general sense from those changes. And that's where I'm looking for the opportunity cost threshold, is in that opportunity cost. It's one of potentially many different margins upon which we're operating, but it's certainly important. And I'll end with my final comment, and that is, I think we do need to pay attention to the dynamic optimization problem, that innovation is important to consider. I would like to see better estimates and better studies on what the actual effect on innovation is likely to be. I would also like to state that we have to choose which margin do we want to improve our healthcare system on. Is it worth trading a reduction in innovation for an increase in universality and access to people who currently are underserved by our healthcare system? But that too is a trade-off that we have to balance. So I'll end it there, and look forward to hearing Professor Danton's comments.
Dave, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Patricia, please introduce yourself and let us know your comments.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm Patricia Danton. I am Professor Emeritus at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And for many of the last years of my research and teaching, I focused on pharmaceuticals, the effect of regulation, and different healthcare systems. I really appreciate Jens's presentation in providing background on the European approach in its varieties. I want to start off by addressing the question, the fundamental question that I think we're trying to address in this session, which is why have thresholds at all? And I start from the vantage point of seeing the rise, the relentless rise of prices in the US and the need for some sort of constraint on prices. Jens showed the graph showing the rise in MS and anti-TNF drugs. You can look at other categories as well. And the fundamental problem is that with our insurance system, basically, patients, we rely on patients' cost sensitivity, price sensitivity through cost sharing to try to constrain prices. But that conflicts with providing good financial protection to patients. And so we've moved towards insurance coverage that gives stop loss protection. In other words, a catastrophic limit, an upper limit on out-of-pocket payment for patients. But that means that once they have blown through that upper limit in their cost sharing, they're really indifferent to whether the price is $100,000 or $150,000. It doesn't affect their cost sharing. And so we rely entirely on payers to put some sort of constraint on prices. And at the moment, the system that the PBMs use of trying to negotiate rebates works well for categories of drugs, the traditional drugs where there is close substitutability and patients and physicians are willing to have their choices driven by modest differences in co-payments. But it does not work for the specialty drugs, the MS drugs, the cancer drugs, where there are distinct differentiations and where we see the payers resorting to putting a high co-insurance rate, a fourth tier, and a 25 to 30% co-insurance rate, that then means patients either cannot afford the drugs or they can afford them only because they've got supplementary coverage, which makes them price insensitive. So our system simply breaks down for these specialty drugs. Now, in a paper that I published with Adrian Towers and Jorge Mesre-Ferrandes in 2013, we showed why we felt that a cost-effectiveness approach with an ISA threshold is the most efficient way to constrain prices for payers, not only because, as Jens pointed out, it does fundamentally assure that consumers are getting an equal bang for their buck, no matter whether they're spending on diabetes drugs or cancer drugs, but that threshold can be changed if you want a different bang for the buck across different thresholds, across different therapeutic categories. But the sort of starting principle is we want to maximize health gain for the money spent, whether that budget is fixed in the short run or not. But then also that this threshold approach in fact creates incentives for appropriate investment in R&D, what we call dynamic efficiency, because precisely it rewards drugs that deliver significant incremental innovation in either higher outcomes for patients or cost savings. It is a mechanism that delivers value-based pricing. And that is moderately true of the sort of reference price alternative that Jens described, but it is more rigorously and more precisely structured in a cost effectiveness approach with a threshold. I don't think this necessarily means that we have to put the US system into a rigid budget and a rigid one-size-fits-all, which would be politically unacceptable. One can easily structure systems that allow for different thresholds for different health plans, whether this is done as discounts off one threshold or different plans choosing different thresholds. It's a matter of practicality which way one goes, but it's not hard to do. And I do think that for all we value diversity and allowing people to pay for their preferences for healthcare, we do want to commit to a floor for everybody, and that could be established with a threshold-based system that could provide financial stability in terms of the rise of a relentless rise of spending on pharmaceuticals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was just outstanding and a great way, again, to bring some perspective to these issues as we start off. Jens, why don't I give you a chance to respond or ask questions back of either Dave or Patricia, if you'd like.
Yeah, I want to keep that short because I kind of already took a lot of time in the presentation. I agree with those comments. I think we can have different assumptions or different going in assumptions. Do we need a fixed budget? What are these different requirements in here? I'm concerned that in those systems, and we have these discussions in Europe at the moment, that the threshold is actually going lower and lower because we are having a very kind of strong opportunity cost approach in there. And that makes it, in a kind of increasingly genericized market, more and more difficult than to bring innovation into that market. So that's why I'm kind of trying to find a system where you're not having these formal constraints. But I can also understand Patricia's and Dave's arguments in there. So I think these are things which we'll discuss over time. I don't want to comment further here. Just keep it open for other questions. Thank you.
All right. So, Carl.
Thank you. That was truly outstanding. Really enjoyed it. I'll try and be brief because I know I'm going to get a number of bites of this, Jerry. But I think Jens's distinctions that he tries to draw are a bit more apparent than real. I mean, we need to be clear. A threshold is just the criteria by which a decision-making body decides whether you're going to call something cost-effective or not. Your choice is whether you do that explicitly or you don't do it explicitly and allow that to be done implicitly, including the trade-off between diabetes and cancer in Germany, because that still exists. I think, in a way, as Pat was exactly saying, is that using an explicit threshold based on what Dave talked about, health opportunity cost, means that we do indeed disincentivize innovations that don't offer any benefit, because your price premium is zero. So you're going to get paid the same as the generic. But as Pat was saying, it becomes much more subtle and important because we're basically scaling the reward to the benefit that's been achieved. A really good example is the NICE threshold of £20,000 to £30,000. It wasn't magic, it was an implied value. It was based on a paper that Mike Rawlins and Tony Collier wrote, 2004, which took the 20 to 30 as the values that were implicit in the decisions that we as a committee had made. I have to tell you, I and the rest of my committee were pretty unhappy about those numbers, but nonetheless, that's where it came from, simply an implied value. But at the same time, NICE says it ought to represent what we expect to give up as a consequence of having to meet these new requirements from existing commitments. In other words, as Jens has characterised it, a single payer, single budget. But even if it's not a fixed budget, these things still matter. Even if we're increasing resources, we've still got to ask the question, what else could we have done with those resources with existing technologies? That's the hurdle that innovation has to pass. And I totally agree with Dave, when it comes to a private health insurance system, it's slightly different again. Then the question becomes, what are the health effects of increasing healthcare costs and the rising premiums and increasing deductibles? And just finally on static, is this about simply static efficiency? If it was just about static efficiency, we wouldn't need thresholds. We would just maximise on monopoly power, we would drive down prices to marginal cost, and we would say to hell with your IP, because we don't care. We're going to free ride. That's not what this is about. This is about saying, how much can we afford? And in the German system, answering the question for the Germans, how much do you need to negotiate that down when there are additional benefits? That's what it's about. And in many respects, it's absolutely about respecting those dynamic benefits that are embedded in our acceptance of patent protection. The truth of the matter right now in the UK is that because NICE is making decisions way above what we can afford, we're not just giving away the maximum during the patent, we're giving away more than 100% of the entire life cycle value, including the long run generics. I'm going to have to stop because I've said too much and I need to go and do some yoga, but it's a great start.
Good. Thanks.
So you've just had a good intro to Carl Claxton. And more to come when we talk about opportunity costs. I'm going to encourage people also on the phone again, or on the webinar, to go ahead and feel free to submit questions or comments. We'll try to get to some of them. We can't get to all of them. We had one, I'm trying to make sure I can frame it correctly as a question, but how right now, what is the best research we have that tries to estimate the health consequences of rising costs of healthcare or of innovation? What do we think? And Jens, you may not feel like you're the best person to answer that question. If not, maybe I can toss it out to Patricia or Dave. Did you understand I'm framing a question that came through about methods or the knowledge we have about how we estimate the health consequences of rising costs of healthcare and of innovation. Patricia, let me try you. Any thoughts on that?
I think that is an extraordinarily difficult question to ask because you've got to control for all the other factors that play into health outcomes for a population over time. So I personally haven't seen any good studies take that on. I have seen some studies try to measure the effect of innovative drugs, for example, the health benefits of having available innovative drugs or other particular technologies, but that's much more limited. And even those studies are always, I think, the conclusions are tentative because there's always the question of were all the other possible confounding factors appropriately controlled for? And if they weren't, one is at risk of either overestimating or underestimating the effect of either increased or decreased access to healthcare because of rising cost. So that's the sort of over time effect. I think there is also the sort of distributive effect of that there is a tendency, particularly in the US, to say, well, we're not going to consider trying to approach universal coverage until we've got costs better under control. And even if we don't say that explicitly, it is a political reality that when we're faced with the price tag of trying to go to universal coverage, there's a shrinking back from such proposals because they are so expensive, precisely because we've let costs run out of control for so long. So, I think that both in the, it's a factor in our willingness to accept universal coverage, as well as freezing out other ways that we might spend both public and private budgets over time.
All right, thank you very much. We've got about 4 minutes left. I want Jens to have a chance to answer a question in his sweet spot here. So I wanted to link back the question of innovation and how Germany functions with its view towards cost effectiveness or lack thereof. So because I know we'll talk a lot about what the word innovation means and how it's valued. Your description of how it worked out in England with the Ian Kennedy Commission, I would spin it slightly differently from my memory of how that happened. There was a lot of political hand waving to a certain extent, and it was very hard at the end of the day for people to understand. And I even think today that the use of the term innovation by NICE's appraisal committees can be interpreted as ticking the box, or it could be interpreted as taking it seriously, and you will hear different stories about that from people involved. But let's turn back to Germany and innovation, where you said that Germany in general is more favorable to innovative medicines. So I don't believe the EMA has yet approved 2 drugs that we've just done a review on here at ICER recently, Spinraza and Zolgensma, for a very severe condition called spinal muscular atrophy. Using cost effectiveness, our review suggested that Spinraza, which costs in the U.S. $750,000 for the first year and then $350,000 thereafter for the rest of the lifetime of the child, would need to be decreased its price by about 85% to meet a cost effectiveness threshold. Whereas Zolgensma, one-time administration of a gene therapy, could be priced up to $2.1 million. Germany gets these drugs. They may already be covering Spinraza because it is approved by the EMA. It ticks the box on either considerable or whatever major. So they go behind closed doors. How do they come up with a price? If they are not using a cost effectiveness threshold, are they peeking over their shoulders at England, at the US? Are they doing something else? How do they come up with a price?
So there are 2 different things. I mean, Spinraza kind of fits into the German system. It's a chronic treatment in there. It has a relatively high price. It is a very severe population in there. I don't know where they will end up with that, but given that there is such a significant patient benefit in such a vulnerable population, the German system would be able to cover these things. I would assume that, there is an expectation that there is a certain discount that has been negotiated, but that will not be dramatic because this is a drug that that people want. They want to be involved in that. We've seen that with other kind of innovative drugs.
So does that mean that the company should price it at twice what they charge in the U.S. because the Germans will say yes?
No, I think the U.S. price is known. So Germany doesn't formally reference the U.S., but it is unusual for a drug to come in and be at that price above the U.S. There have been examples. I can remember 2 where that was the case, but it wasn't dramatically. It was more kind of driven by currency fluctuations at that time. I think the problem that the German system will face is how it will deal with curative therapies, one-off therapies, because the basis, there is one kind of, the German system is quite good, but it also has a number of very unfortunate things, and they always compare annual treatment costs. And they have huge issues with drugs that don't have an annual treatment cost. So they will now say Spinraza as the comparator has an annual treatment cost of 750,000, whatever that number is. The Zolgensma annual treatment cost will be 2.1 million, assuming that the similar price is used in there, and that will make it difficult for them. So this is an interesting tendency that we have at the moment, that systems that use cost effectiveness, they've always been used to looking at episode of care costs. They do not have a kind of arbitrary thing to say that I look at an annual or monthly cost. From an episode of care perspective, the Zolgensma price is not kind of completely surprising you. It is what you pay for Spinraza over 5 years. It's kind of pegged against that. In the German system, it will be difficult. So there needs to be some innovation to deal with those curative therapies.
Okay. So we'll look for innovation on the HTA side to meet the innovation on the drug side. All right. Well, I wish we had a lot more time, but we don't, and we need to keep these to an hour. So I just want to thank Jens very much for his presentation, Dave Van Ness and Patricia Danton as well. I'll leave you all with an interesting thought. Just reflect that cost effectiveness, sometimes its use seems to travel in Anglo-Saxon channels through the old British Commonwealth, whereas Germanic and Frankish approaches seem somewhat different. Whether there's a message there or just a false analogy, I have no idea. But cultural factors and how we view the broader philosophical issues related to cost effectiveness are in some ways deeply tied into the way that different countries will respond. So is the U.S. an Anglo-Saxon country or something different? We'll take that up on our future webinar. Stay tuned tomorrow for the next one, where Chris McCabe will kick us off with a deeper dive into willingness to pay, and we'll have responses from David Meltzer, Lou Garrison, and Jens Groger again. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.